In April of 1977, a group of women began to gather in a plaza. It was called the Plaza de Mayo, outside of the presidential palace in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The women began as a small group that gathered together, and then over the coming days and weeks, their numbers swelled to hundreds and then to thousands until they filled the entire plaza and would not leave. And they were there with signs and with banners, and they were there to protest the actions of the government in Argentina, which at the time in the late 70s was ruled by a military junta led by a guy named Jorge Videla, who was absolute terror to the people. Many of these women had young children, young adults who had simply disappeared, been taken off the streets, had simply vanished. No one knew where they went, hundreds and thousands of them because they had opposed the military regime. Many of them had also had infants, children, taken away from them. Hundreds of these infants, no one knew what had happened to any of them. Until years later, it was revealed that these infants had been kidnapped from their mothers and placed with families who were pro-regime to sort of re-educate them. And as a penalty, a way to penalize these women for opposing the iron fist of Jorge Videla. And as they gathered together, they held banners and they put up signs and they wore white scarves, which became the symbol of their movement, which became known as the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. And many of them on these banners had written words that you'll find familiar from our liturgy today. He will cast down the mighty from their thrones and lift up the lowly. And so the ruling military junta did the only logical thing you can do in a situation like that. They banned the Magnificat. I'm not kidding. Jorge Videla's secret police would go out and would arrest people for putting up those words, would take down their signs, their banners, their posters, because they dared to use those words from that young Jewish woman 2,000 years before, who would cast a word of prophecy about God's justice and what God was doing. Well, those madres of the plaza had the last word. In 1981, Videla was overthrown and deposed. He was quite literally cast down from his throne. He ended up being charged with human rights abuses and crimes against humanity, and he died in prison. The Magnificat lasted a lot longer than Jorge Videla did. God's justice in God's time. You know, it's interesting, as I looked into this incident a little bit, I began to find out that we don't really know this, we don't talk about it very often, but that Magnificat, that Song of Mary, has often been considered a little too hot for TV. It's been banned in more than one place. It was not only banned in Argentina, it was also banned in Guatemala, and it was banned at various times in places in the British Raj in India as well, because the idea was people might read that and they might get ideas. They might get revolutionary ideas, if you will. And so the Magnificat has had a powerful place in many people's hearts and minds and lives as a work about prophetic justice and the power of God to overturn evil. It's been an inspiration to many millions over the years. And if it wasn't so powerful, why would people be interested in banning it, right? An interesting question to ask. So let's talk a little bit about the Magnificat, what it represents, where it comes from, and I think some of the deeper meaning that we might find in it, because today in our lectionary we're given that Song of Mary as a canticle for us to sing, and you're going to hear it, not only did you just hear it and say it as part of our liturgy, but you're going to hear it sung again by our choir quite beautifully when we come to the time of our offertory, but we often don't really sit with its power, I think. So what the Song of Mary is, that Magnificat, we call it that because of the Latin phrase, my soul magnifies the Lord, right? From that opening stanza, is based on and drawn from a long tradition in the Bible of Hebrew women singing songs of praise and offering words of prophecy about justice. One of the first examples of this comes in the book of Exodus after the people have crossed through the Red Sea and they've been saved from the Egyptians. They've been led out of slavery. It's the prophet Miriam, who happens to be Moses' sister, who goes out with a tambourine. We heard a beautiful example of that today, who goes out with a tambourine before the people and she sings and dances. And her words are words that will prefigure some of the later language of the Magnificat. I sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. Miriam's words, you hear echoes of that in the reading today. Miriam's words that are celebrating the triumph of these poor, downtrodden, these people who have just escaped from slavery into freedom, who've just been freed from the yoke of their oppressors. And Miriam sings and dances and says these words to celebrate that. There's, however, another echo that in some ways is even stronger, a way that prefigured Mary's own words that we hear in the book of Samuel that comes from Hannah. Hannah, we are told, is a woman who desperately longs for a child and doesn't have one. And then one day she learns that she's pregnant, and her child she dedicates to the service of God. Her child will become the judge and the prophet Samuel. And Hannah goes to the temple and she offers a song, which of course we also call the Song of Hannah in our liturgy. And she says, "My heart exults in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God." Does that sound familiar? Very much so. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He makes them sit with princes. Doesn't that sound awfully familiar? It's the same sentiment, nearly the same words, the same idea, the same prophetic vision and message that we hear in the Song of Mary, but several hundred years earlier from the mouth of Hannah. Mary was probably drawing from that same tradition of these Jewish women lifting up a prophetic vision, a prophetic image of God's justice. And we can compare that directly with Mary's song. He has shown the strength of his arms, scattered the proud in their conceit, cast down the mighty from their thrones, lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. It's a message, by the way, that we hear echoed also in Jesus' own teaching, in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, in the Beatitudes. It's about that great reversal, it's often called by theologians. The image of God's justice, God's mercy, the image of what a righteous world is, contrasted with the world we live in, which is not that, which is often the opposite of that. I want to say a couple things about the Song of Mary that I think are really interesting for us to contemplate. The first is, I think we should think about this as a work of prophecy. Now, of course, I don't mean prophecy in a Nostradamus sense, as in predicting the future, although it does do a bit of that, but prophecy in the ancient Hebrew understanding of the term as being about the justice and message of God that will overcome the evil of the world. It's that message. It's a message about restoration that Mary has. It's a message of prophecy. And something about that is very interesting. It uses what some commentators have called prophetic tense. And what they mean by that, when they say prophetic tense, is they mean that Mary doesn't say, God will do this at some point in the future. God will maybe, we hope, kind of do this at some point eventually. Mary says, God has done this. She puts it in past tense. And I think that's really interesting because I think if you think about the world in which Mary was born into, the world in which Jesus lived in, that first century world, if you think about it for just more than 1 second, you'll wonder, why on earth does she speak like this? Mary was very poor. It was a poor family, and we know this because when they go to the temple, on the 8th day for Jesus, the celebration of Jesus' baptism, not baptism, circumcision, when they go to the 8th day to the temple, they pay the price of turtle doves, which the poor were told to pay, not the thing that you could afford it, the bigger offerings that wealthy people paid. They paid what poor people did. So we know he comes from a very poor family that would have been allowed to make that sacrifice, the one that they could afford. And we know that the world that she lived in was a world filled with tyrants. I want you to think about the fact that Augustus Caesar was on the throne in Rome when she said those words. Augustus, who took that name, that was not his original name. His original name was Octavian, by the way. But he took the name Augustus, which means exalted one or revered one, and then sent a message to the entire Roman Empire that he was to be worshiped as a god, a living god, Augustus, in the imperial city of Rome. That was the world that Mary spoke into. That was the world that she talked about. Not only that, but the puppet king Herod, the puppet of Augustus, was on the throne of Judea, was pulling strings there. And just a page later in our story about the Christmas tradition, the Christmas story, we'll hear about how Herod tried to kill these many infants to stop Jesus from being born, to stop him from being the Messiah. He was still doing evil things from his place of power. And yet Mary says, he has cast down the mighty from their thrones, not something that was going to happen in the future, but something that has happened. That's what we mean when we say prophetic tense. Because Mary is speaking in past tense here. She's speaking as if the work of God is inevitable. It's going to happen. It is happened. It has happened in the past. It is being accomplished. And I think that shows Mary's profound faith. That is an incredible faith. Think about that for a moment. The world she lived in was an incredibly unjust world. So much worse in many ways from the one we live in. A world where slavery, for example, was just accepted as the way things are. Where tyrants were on every throne that you knew of. And yet Mary speaks as if God has already accomplished this work, has already accomplished it in their midst. Some of that may be due to that tradition that we've already spoken about of the Jewish people and the women that she's standing in line of and speaking alongside, but I think it's also due to her profound faith in what God has and will be accomplishing, so much so, with such profound sense of that she talks about it as if it's already happened, it's a done deal, it's inevitable, there's no question. It's her eyes of faith that tell us that. You know, there's this way in which sometimes we talk about wishful thinking. I hope such and such will happen. I want such and such to happen at some time. And you're hoping that something will eventually be fulfilled, but you know you don't want to be disappointed, right? So you sort of keep that in your back pocket, that cynicism. But that's not what we hear from Mary. What we hear instead is an incredible statement of faith. That God has done this and continues to do it. That Christian hope is that God's victory over evil is inevitable, is destined to happen, and will happen. Do we have that kind of faith? I don't know. That's a tough one for me. Do we have faith to believe that with our heart and soul like Mary did? That's a profound thing to think about. The other thing I want to mention about the Magnificat, about this Song of Mary, is that it's an example to me of how we have domesticated Christmas and everything around it. You know, we've taken Christmas and we've taken it and we've made it be about a bunch of cute shepherds and a bunch of cute angels with halos and wings and a bunch of sheep, you know, and put them around a cute baby and his parents. And we say, that's nice, that's Christmas, and we go home and drink eggnog, right? That's a cultural kind of domestication. We've made it about something for children, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in doing that, we sometimes forget the other side of it, that what Mary is talking about, what Jesus' ministry in the world means, is that something is happening in the world that is profound. A change in the relationship between humanity and God, but also a change in God's kingdom. That God's kingdom is coming with justice into this world. That there's an inevitable victory of light over darkness that we're proclaiming. We act as if the Song of Mary is some kind of lullaby that we sing to children. Folks, it's not a lullaby. It's a call for regime change. That's what it is. And the regime change that Mary is speaking about, casting down the mighty and lifting up the lowly, is about God's justice in this world. It's about the things of the world, power and money and prestige, and those being cast down, because in God's kingdom, it's the lowly and the poor and the humble who are lifted up, who are exalted. Jesus confirms that himself many times. And so we take these things and we domesticate them. We make them kind of warm and fuzzy. We sort of we sort of pad them. You know what I mean? We turn them into lullabies and Christmas carols and put up nice, pretty trees and burn Yule logs and all that kind of stuff, when we change it into something that is not quite its original meaning. Maybe there's a fear in us that this stuff is actually true. And if it's true and it's real, it might require something from us or say something about God that is profoundly disturbing, that casts our current world into an uncertain place or light. We take these things about Christmas and we change them into something that's soft around the edges, that's warm and fuzzy. But I don't think this is warm and fuzzy. It's more like a battle hymn. Mary's not messing around. Mary's so not messing around that her words have been banned several times across several countries because they mean powerful things. They give people ideas about what the kingdom of God is. And that itself is worth remembering and recognizing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say that Mary's hymn is the greatest Advent hymn of all time. Of course it is. It's an expression of that wild hope for God's justice and God's kingdom. And by the way, Bonhoeffer would know. He was executed in a concentration camp on the direct orders of Adolf Hitler. That's not a lullaby he was talking about. That's something else. It's an Advent hymn that cracks open the world and asks us to look at it with new eyes. That's the Song of Mary. Listen to how Jesus described his own ministry today when the followers of John the Baptist came to ask him, "Are you really the Messiah?" Because apparently John just wasn't totally sure, wanted some to know a little more. I mean, I would too, right? We wanted to ask. And Jesus describes his ministry in very concrete ways. He talks about the lepers who are healed, the blind who receive their sight, the dead who are raised, all elements of healing. He talks about the poor having good news, the gospel, that is, proclaimed to them. Jesus says, in other words, Jesus doesn't say, "Oh yeah, of course I'm the Messiah. You should know that by now." He gives a different answer, a much more cryptic answer, the kind of answer Jesus would actually give. And he says, he sort of says, "By your fruits you'll know me." He says, "Look at what I'm doing. Is this the work of the Messiah? You better believe it is." That's how we know. That's the world that Jesus has called us to. That's the world that Mary's song speaks to. It's a world of healing, a world of righteousness, a world that it's turned on its head, where the things we think make people powerful, things we think make people rich, the things we think are exalted in this life are cast down, and the reign of God is lifted up. So today, when you hear that Song of Mary, don't domesticate it. Think about the tyrants who wanted to ban it. Think about the ways it's spoken in people's hearts as a word of hope, a word that calls them into a new reality, spoken by this teenage woman prophet so many years ago, and yet still speaks to us today. That is the Song of Mary. Let's pray. Holy Lord, you are the Messiah. You are the one who is coming into the world, and we look to you with hope and faith that your kingdom of justice and righteousness will prevail. Holy One, help us to see this, not with the eyes of cynicism, not with the eyes given to us by social media, but with the eyes of faith, with the eyes of Mary. In your holy name, amen.